Hello physical fiends and horror fiends. Here we have a list of all the Switch physical games that are horror or horror themed, at least most of them. What constitutes as horror and how did I make this list? Because, some games are full on bedwetting experiences, and yet there is also an audience for, cutesy camp horror or perhaps horror adjacent games. So I was in a quandary about how to approach this video, and I asked my subscribers on the community post to vote, should this video be pure horror or also include horror adjacent? And they voted. Not exactly substantially, but it was in favor of including everything. But in the comments, there were some fair points arguing in the favor of keeping it pure horror so that it's not clickbait. People click on a horror video, they expect horror, I get it. So I'm doing the impossible and trying to keep everyone happy. The pure horror fans happy, the horror themed fans happy. The first half of this video will consist of horror games that have the intent to scare the player. That is their entire purpose. Whether they are successful at it or not is a moot point. The point is, they tried to make it a scary horror game. Don't blame me if they were naff at it. The second half of this video will include games with horror themes, games that are not designed with the express purpose of scaring you. It's more atmosphere, vibes, and being a little bit spoopy. They may be scary, but that's not their main intent. In fact, some of them may not be scary at all, but due to their theming, you wouldn't mind playing them around Halloween time. It's just a good horror mood. Sometimes you need a cute pumpkin monster, alright? Basically, the first half of this video is for those who say Die Hard is not a Christmas movie. The second half is for those who say Die Hard is a Christmas movie. Now, I have not played all the games in this video. Some I've barely even heard of them, never mind playing them, so there may be a bit of debate as to which category some games should be in. I am using my feeling on some of them. Others I'm going by what reviews say, and if a developer once mentions horror in their PR or gaming tags, it's definitely in the first half. So without further ado, let's start with the games designed to be scary. Alyssa. I want to start with this one because it is a game I literally helped get a physical release for with Premium Edition Games, and I am very proud of that. When I joined Premium Edition Games, it was a high target for me and almost like a dream because I didn't think I'd be able to do it. But I did, and I hope you can support its physical release to support me. Pre-orders for the physical version will be opening in the near future at premiumeditiongames.com if you check the links in the description. And yeah, I hope you can support it. This is an absolute love letter to old school Resident Evil games, especially the original. I love it. It's got the atmosphere, it's got the puzzles. For me, it's the closest you're gonna get to the mid-90s survival horror awesomeness. Check the links down below in the description if you want to pre-order a copy. They may be open by the time this video goes out. There will be a couple of editions available, and yeah, Alyssa is a great game for old school survival horror fans. Go check it out. Alien Isolation is arguably the best horror game on the Switch, at least if we're talking about mixing production value with pure fear. Creative Assembly did an amazing job creating one of the best games set within the Alien franchise. You take control of Amanda Ripley, Ellen Ripley's daughter, who wants to find out what happened to her mother. And she ends up in just as much trouble, if not even worse dangers and situations than her mother went through. Physically, this was done by Limited Run Games, and at the time of writing this, Video Games Plus still have some copies available. Speaking of which, if you want any physical game, then please consider using the links in the description and pinned comment. Video Games Plus is a fantastic company with free worldwide shipping if you purchase over 80 Canadian dollars, that's about 60 American dollars, and they are my preferred way to pick up retail releases. They're a fantastic company with good prices, and any purchase you make via clicking a link before really does help me out so much. I really appreciate it. I haven't linked like every game in this video, I've just put some general links down, so you might have to find them yourself, but yeah, thank you so much. Absulov, End of Gods, is a futuristic Viking-inspired first-person horror game that has certain vibes of maybe Penumbra. It mixes puzzle elements with exploration, and the horror isn't full-on. You probably won't be bobbing yourself all the way through, but you'll have a good sense of dread. I personally haven't played the Switch version, but having seen footage of it running on the system, it looks and runs okay. In terms of a physical release, it was only released physically in Japan and Asian regions, but it does have English, so you can import it. Blair Witch, also, funnily enough, a physical that is an import exclusive that has English. This was a game made by Bloober Team, and this is possibly one of their least remembered titles. They are known for Layers of Fear, Observer, and the upcoming remake of Silent Hill 2. However, this game has a dog in it that helps the main character as you explore an open-ish world, and yeah, it can be a little bit disorientating, but hey, I guess that mirrors the movie very well. The Bridge Curse: Road to Salvation is another import exclusive. I promise I didn't do this on purpose. It's alphabetical, and this one is a Play Asia exclusive. It's a Taiwanese horror game that I found to be pretty good. It's got good production with the character models and detail, good setting and lore, and really intrigued me a lot. As a Play Asia exclusive, sadly it's sold out by now. Maybe there will be a reprint in the future, who knows. The Bridge Curse 2: The Extrication is coming later this year, but this is not an import exclusive and will be available at wider retail in the West. I haven't played this one, but reviews for the Steam version seem to indicate it's also pretty good, but has a larger focus on the story and characters than perhaps the horrors of the first game. Maybe a little bit too much of a walking simulator for some. Buddy Simulator 1984, perhaps being on this list is a bit of a spoiler in and of itself. It's one of those games that you're not supposed to realize is a horror game. The game's blurb makes no mention of psychological horror and sells it as kind of like a family-friendly game. This is not like shocking horror, but something to make you feel very unnerved. Many have compared this to Undertale due to its lo-fi visual style, and limited run games did the physical for this in North America. Call of Cthulhu is a Lovecraftian horror game going deep into psychological and cosmic horror. This is more about investigating and puzzles rather than anything action orientated, which put a lot of people off. Maybe they were expecting like a Bloodborne or something, but this is maybe more similar to Alan Wake in a few ways. There are a few tense moments and chases, but it's more about soaking in the dreading atmosphere. Carrion is often described as a reverse horror game because you are the horror. You are the monster that's on a bender, escaping a facility and murdering all the scientists and soldiers who have been poking you. Something like that. I haven't played it myself. If you want a Metroidvania, then this is one to look into. The physical was initially done by Limited Run and Special Reserve in North America, but later came in a general retail release in Europe as well. Chaos Head Noah and Chaos Child are probably not conventional choices for horror game fans, but when it comes to visual novels that have horror elements thrown in, the psychological horror on show here is one of the best. With a theme of delusion and mental illness, these two VNs that are in the science adventure universe are definitely ones you should give a try. They also feature main protagonists that you'd probably want to be in a horror movie because, you'd want them to get picked off by one of the slashers because they're a bit of a prick. But that's a good thing in this case. These two games released in a very nice double pack. Sharon's Staircase. That's always a name that makes me laugh. Like, what's so interesting about Sharon's Staircase? It sounds like a euphemism the milkman or window cleaner would use. I'm just off to pay a visit to Sharon's Staircase while her husband's at work. Anyways, it's the Greek myth Sharon, not the unsatisfied housewife at 34 Sycamore Road. The game. This is supposed to be a pretty average first-person horror game where you, as an agent of the government, are sent into a place where atrocities occurred, and you have to help cover up all the evidence, but it will lead you into something far more worrying. Apparently, I don't know. Clear Complete Collection is a physical release that was done by Limited Run in North America, and this includes Clear and Clear 2. Both of them are side-scrolling survival horror games, both of which pride themselves on not resorting to jump scares. Any fear is actually earned. A lot of people love these, but personally it's hard for me to get over the art style and animation, just not my personal tastes. Clock Tower Rewind had pre-orders from limited run games in North America, but if you missed that, there is an upcoming Japanese and Asian physical release that does have English, and to be honest, I think the cover art is way more interesting there. This is a classic point-and-click horror game as you are in a mansion being stalked by a scissor-wielding killer. They're more like shears, not like scissors you cut string with. You cut your head off with these things. There is a lot of trial and error in this game, from what I've heard, but it's one of the earliest examples of survival horror, and I definitely want to give it a try with this remaster. The Coma Double Cut was an import exclusive, a double pack of Coma games released physically in Asia and Japan, but they did have English. This is another side-scrolling survival horror game that has you exploring a school at night, where there is a merciless killer on the loose, stalking your every move. I love the vibe it's going for, but Coma 1 missed the mark for me in terms of execution. Good ideas that were not translated well to code, but the second game picks things up nicely, and I did enjoy that one. It kind of fixed most of the issues pretty much. Very recently, after I recorded this section, it was announced that a double pack will be getting a European Deluxe Edition via Game Fairy, so look out for that. Corpse Party 2 Darkness Distortion is getting a physical release on the Switch sometime this year, and surprisingly, despite there being a few Corpse Party games already on the Switch, this is the only one with the physical goods. I find this series immensely confusing from an outsider perspective, especially this one, because there is already a game called Corpse Party 2, but it looks completely different and has a different subtitle, Dead Patient. Please, fans of the series, I need a full idiot-proof explanation of this series' games. The Count Lucanor was one of the earlier horror games on the Switch that got a physical release. I even remember covering it on my ancient channel in the first year of the Switch's life, but for the life of me, I can't remember much about it, but reviews and opinions tell me it's very surreal, has cool imagery, despite the hyperpixelation. The physical release for this was only in Europe. Dark Wood got a physical release in Europe in limited quantities via Super Rare Games. This is a highly rated survival horror game with a big emphasis on the survival aspect. But don't let the survival part put you off, because many will say it's one of the best top-down horror games ever made. It's quiet horror, meaning it's not always in your face, but it sort of looms over you the entire time. There's an empty dread to the game, and it's seeping in atmosphere. Dark is a surreal nightmare of a game that messes heavily with perspectives and what is reality. It's tagged as a psychological horror game, but maybe that's just talking about the puzzles that you'll come across. Maybe they are just that brutal. Okay, maybe not, but I'm not wholly convinced you'll be scared by playing this, even though the devs say it is a horror game. Let's trust them. Daymare 1994 Sandcastle is a commendable indie game that's going for some modern Resident Evil vibes. The trailer makes it look good and snazzy, but from reviews I've seen, it seems to indicate there's a lot of story padding, not much to the gameplay with only a couple of weapons to use. It's not a big budget horror shooter, that's for sure. Even though this was supposed to get a Western physical release, I guess that got cancelled, but there is a Japanese physical release that does have English. Dead by Daylight has 5 physical editions on Nintendo Switch, believe it or not. The first one, like the base game, got a retail release in the West, but 4 expansions of sorts, I don't really get it to be honest, they were released only in Japan. If you watched my imports video before, you'll know that the 5th Anniversary Edition, Sadako Rising, Silent Hill Edition, and the Ultimate Edition all got physical English releases in Japan. Dead by Daylight is an asymmetrical online multiplayer game, your classic 4v1, and the horror is strong with this one, especially with all the licenses attached to it. Deadly Premonition Origins is the cult classic open world horror game that the world laughed at during the 360 era, but then like a decade later said, hang on, we want to play that again. And so here it is on the Nintendo Switch. Deadly Premonition is the definition of jank, a game so weird you're not sure how intentional it is. Heavily inspired by Twin Peaks, if you want a Twin Peaks video game, then you must play this. It may be more funny than scary, but I admit when I first saw one of the enemies, I did feel my scrotum ascend in anticipation. Deadly Premonition 2, A Blessing in Disguise, is a sequel that came 10 years later and surprised no one in how it couldn't quite live up to the original. It's not as good as the first game, nor is it as bad as the first game. At least that's what reviews told me. I haven't had the chance to play this one as of yet, but I think if you're one of the cult members of Deadly Premonition, you should probably give this one a try as well. Desolatium is a first-person point-and-click horror game, at least that's what I'm told by various sources. The trailer doesn't scream horror to me. What do I know? Oh, I know that despite the very interesting presentation, the game is supposed to be an absolute dog turd, more like a hidden object game than a proper point-and-click, and that's a shame because the visuals on this, oh man, I love them. Dollhouse is actually from the same publisher as Desolatium, but thankfully this one is supposed to be a bit better. This has a film noir theme to it, a bit art deco, as though I know what I'm talking about. You are a private detective as you're being hunted down in a cat and mouse style chase. You'll fight enemies, solve puzzles. It's not highly rated, but the trailer, screenshots and descriptions, they're all giving me the urge to try it myself, to be honest. Dreadout Remastered Collection and Dreadout 2 are two physical releases. I'll talk about Dreadout 2 first since that did come out first. This is a bit like Fatal Frame, which I'll get to in the near future, whereby you take photos of ghosts with your smartphone. It's got a budgeted feel to it and feels like a PS2 game, which I liked a lot. It also had an essence of Shenmue in there as well. This was originally only released physically in Asian regions and Japan, but is getting a North American physical release in November. Dreadout Remastered Collection is an upcoming double pack of earlier games in the series, Dreadout 1 and then a spin-off. For now, this is only releasing physically in Asia that we know about, but things can change between now and the release date, which is currently unknown, but we do know it will have English regardless. Dusk is a horror-themed boomer shooter. I did consider putting this in the second half of the video because I don't think it's inherently terrifying, but the violence and gore is pretty full on. And there's some pretty tense moments like being chased in dark corridors. The physical release of this was done in North America via Limited Run Games. It's a pretty badass game. Dying Light is a first-person survival horror game with plenty of action. There is a huge open world filled with zombies to fight with your handcrafted weapons. I've heard it's a really excellent and packed game with lots of thrills and is considered to be one of the best first-person zombie games around. The Exit 8 and Platform 8 Double Pack is an upcoming import exclusive of two games that are basically Let's Play streamer bait. Games made to be streamed to an audience and have live reactions to. I've seen brief snippets of them, kinda popular, but very short walking sim type of games. Good job it's cheap, and it will have English when it releases in Japan. Faith, The Unholy Trinity is a really unique psychological horror game, very lo-fi in its presentation, seemingly made on the Spectrum, but with rotoscoped animation. It's clear a lot of effort went into this, and it looks absolutely sublime. This is releasing in October, and I definitely want to give it a go. A Spectrum-style game that might actually be good? That's genuinely creepy. Fatal Frame Maiden of Blackwater and Fatal Frame Mask of the Lunar Eclipse. These are two Fatal Frame physical releases on Switch. Both of them are import exclusives. These are the fourth and fifth games in the series and are incredible horror games in my opinion. Maybe they were a little bit janky at the time of release, at least in comparison to Western horror games that were being made for the time, but for me, these ooze class and scares as you try to fend off ghosts with your camera. Maiden of Blackwater got a physical release in Asia and Japan, but if you want English, you need to download an update. And Mask of the Lunar Eclipse, you'll want to buy the version for Southeast Asia, since that is the one that does have English, and thankfully this one's on the cartridge. Excellent games, you should own them both. There are 3 Five Nights at Freddy's physical games on the Nintendo Switch, with a 4th coming soon. There's Help Wanted, there's Security Breach, and the Core Collection. And together, these include 7 games in the series, which is a hell of a lot. The Core Collection itself has the first 5 games in the series. Help Wanted 2 is also coming next year. I don't need to explain the series, do I? It helped the career of a good few YouTubers and gave false hopes to many, many more. Forgive Me Father was a game that only released physically in Europe, and up until recently it was a bit of a pain in the arse to get a hold of, maybe a little bit rare. And this is another horror themed boomer shooter, and also another really good one. This is definitely more on the horror side though, with its Lovecraftian visuals. I definitely want to pick this one up myself one day. Frambo sadly isn't the femme fatale version of Rambo, but this is a creepy horror adventure game that was published physically in very limited quantities by Super Rare Games in Europe. There are some very disturbing visuals, and there is a heavy focus on the psychological things, but overall it's supposed to be an excellent game. Friday the 13th, the game, is now a physical only game on the Switch due to the license expiring and it being delisted from the eShop. It is also an online only game, but it's still playable due to the peer-to-peer matching and should be good to go until the end of this year. I think they're going to switch it off completely at that point. I remember there was a time this game was a huge hit, like a fantastic 7 versus 1 game. I don't think it was popular with critics, but it did have a huge online following. Get Me Out Please is an import exclusive game that does have English, only released in Japan, and I don't know a whole lot about it since it is super obscure. I believe it functions in the same way to the Friday the 13th game, and maybe Dead by Daylight, just with a budgeted Japanese twist to it, like in a high school with anime girls, of course, so it must be better, right? Halloween and Ash vs. the Evil Dead is an upcoming physical release. It might be out by the time this video goes out, to be honest. It's a double pack of 2 indie games, each set in a classic horror movie franchise. You can guess what they are from the name alone. Of course, with the pixels and the over-the-top nature, I'm not going to lie and tell you that they are scary, but I think there's enough put into them, to put them in this section of the video. Both games look pretty awesome, to be honest. I'm surprised. Heaven Dust Collection is a double pack that was released in limited quantities by Super Rare Games in Europe. These games are heavily inspired by old school Resident Evil. I mean, you can't tell me the main character is not Chris Redfield. These are 2 indie survival horror games where you'll be doing nice item management, combining herbs. The visuals are a bit kiddish rather than scary, but still considered a very nice homage to the classics. Horror Tales The Wine is the first game in the Horror Tales series and was made by just one person apparently. It's got a unique Mediterranean setting as you are stalked by a killer as you try to find some wine. Hey, we've all been out on an adventure for booze once the stock runs out at a house party, usually not being stalked by killers though. This was released physically by Limited Run Games in North America. The House of the Dead remake is a fun, schlocky horror game. Okay, it's debatable whether it should be in this section or not due to its arcadey gameplay and comedic overtones, but hey, the zombies are pretty nasty looking. This is supposed to be a decent enough remake, but not exactly great, especially considering there's no proper light gun support on the Switch. And let's face it, these Joy-Cons, they can be nice, but they are hardly reliable or immersive. Give me a Dreamcast gun any day of the week. Even ones made by Mad Catz, I'll take one of them. Ib is a horror puzzle game. I really like this one despite the very simple visuals. It looks like an RPG Maker horror game, but I think it works well. The horror is very apparent and unsettling. The game also has pretty decent puzzles and an interesting story, so I did enjoy it. The physical release for this was only in Japan, but it does have English. Ikai is a game that's set in feudal era Japan. It's supposed to be a pretty good game where you draw seals to protect yourself from the yokai. I guess those little bastards escape from the watch again. It's definitely an interesting game, but like many men out there, it falters in length. It's only about 3 hours long. Kolat, I don't know how to say it, is a first-person horror game set in the Ural Mountains and is inspired by the events of the Dilatov Pass, which has fascinated me ever since I heard about it, and I don't want to believe the official narrative. I've gone full conspiracy nut on this one. Anyways, the game itself doesn't quite live up to the legend, with it being based more on the atmosphere than actual scares. It's narrated by Sean Bean though, who one may assume dies before the end, but I don't know. And it was released physically in Europe by Red Art Games. Killer Frequency is supposed to be an enjoyable first-person puzzle horror game as you are a late-night radio host who somehow gets involved in his usual callers being killed off by a serial killer. I don't really know how the gameplay flows with this one or if it's truly scary, but it is a game you should probably put on your watch list at least. just for the concept alone. Layers of Fear Legacy was one of the Bloober team's first horror games, perhaps the one that made them completely shift into the genre. I've played the Switch version, and to be honest, I thought it was more ropey than scary. The visual downgrade was overly distracting compared to the scares. Like, it didn't scare me at all because it just looked terrible. But either way, it was released physically in North America by Limited Run Games. The Letter is a horror visual novel, which you'll know because the subtitle is a horror visual novel. They really wanted you to know that. It's an indie VN, but I think they did a really good job in providing scares and creepy imagery over what is a very long story. This is a Play Asia exclusive, although sadly it's currently sold out. Little Nightmares 1, 2, and 3 are 3 surreal and grotesque horror games, although the latter of which currently isn't out at the time of writing this. It's coming next year, and I'm assuming it's gonna, have a physical release like the other 2, but either way, these are a bunch of really great games that add a lot of puzzle elements and adventure. Perhaps some trial and error gameplay as you try to be stealthy and escape from, but lots of effort was put into these games, and I expect 3 to be just as good despite switching developers. Livestream Escape from Hotel Izanami and Livestream 2 Escape from the Togeazuka Happy Place are 2 very fan service filled horror games that are perhaps more concerned about panty shots than the actual safety of the cast of young ladies getting murdered by a stalker. These physical releases are only available in Asia, the only place who would tolerate this stuff, but hey, they do have English and offer something a little schlocky if you need some culture alongside your horror. I actually think the production value is surprisingly good for these games. Madison is a first-person psychological horror game where you have a Polaroid camera. Instead of following Outcast's advice of shaking it crazy like your booty, you're actually going to want to shake it just because you don't want to die. Since in this video game, it can help you manipulate the environment and also reveal clues that you can't see with the naked eye. Some of the puzzles in this game are randomly generated as well, allowing for replayability, and it's supposed to be actually quite scary. Monstrum is a different kind of horror game in the fact that it's almost completely procedurally generated in its levels and also includes permadeath. You are on a decrepit cargo ship and you have one of 3 potential monsters chasing you, each with their own behaviors. It's supposed to be pretty good, but obviously with its lack of bespoke design and story, it may not be everyone's cup of horror tea. Needy Streamer Overload, also known as Needy Girl Overdose in some places. This is not much of a horror game on the surface, but it's a bit like Doki Doki Literature Club in the fact that it's there to subvert your expectations. It's more psychological horror than pure horror, and it's a gameplay in more like a visual novel style experience, definitely good and a shocking one. Omori is a horror RPG, a very nice one at that. I'm not going to say it has the same reverence as like Undertale, but I think it's pretty close, at least what I've been told. I haven't played this one myself. Many people say they are not the same person as they were after playing this game. It has strong psychological horror stuff about depressing life things, and it may push extra introspective people over into the abyss. I don't know. Either that or they could be meme reviews. It could happen. Let me know in the comments. Is this like a legit thing? Don't give me the memes, okay? Onimusha Warlords is an old school action horror game, and it's what you get if you mix Resident Evil with samurai and yokai. It's not inherently scary, but it oozes the atmosphere that you'd expect from Capcom in the very early 2000s. It's a pretty short game, but I think it's a really excellent game, and it's a shame the rest of the series did not make it to the Switch. This physical release was only available in Japan, but it does have English. Outbreak Collection Part 1 is a triple pack of crappy survival horror games. It includes Outbreak, Outbreak the New Nightmare, and Outbreak the Nightmare Chronicles. These are the kind of games that should appeal to me. They seem to have all the right ingredients, but fail at executing them as well as Jill executes a hunter. This was done by Limited Run Games in North America with 2 cover versions. One was exclusive to their website, while the other was on Amazon. You can probably still get it. Outbreak Collection Part 2 is a double pack that contains Outbreak Epidemic and Outbreak Lost Hope. Once again, same sort of thing. 2 mediocre games with all the right ideas but not enough time spent thinking about how to put them together properly. It was done by Limited Run in North America. They still have some on their website right now. Probably a lot of them because of course it didn't sell well. Outbreak, Contagious Memories, another one limited run did in North America with 2 cover versions. Same story. These games could have been really good if the developer spent more time with them instead of pumping like a game out every 6 months. Outlast, Bundle of Terror, and Outlast 2 are perhaps some of the most terrifying games available on the Nintendo Switch. I mean, I cannot play these games. They're just way too stressful in terms of the amount of underwear that needs to be changed. Like, you can't fight in this game, you can only run and hide with stealth-based gameplay against an unpredictable enemy. Just for clarity, the Bundle of Terror is the first game alongside its DLC. Both of these physical releases were very early releases from limited run games in North America, which means they are very now sadly going for over $200 a pop. They are really good games, but you just play them on Steam instead, like don't pay that physical price. Oxide Room 104 is an escape room type game with roguelike ideas that if you die, you literally start the entire game again. The puzzles are supposed to be good, it's supposed to be nicely creepy and scary, but that game mechanic may completely put off many players. Dying apparently does change the layout of some things, like things become more warped and maybe even more difficult, so you'll need a lot of patience for this one, but for those who don't mind that mechanic, you'll probably really enjoy it. Pixel Pulp's Collection is a horror game in as much as pulpy 60s horror stories can be. This is a triple pack of visual novels with a visual presentation that you'd find on the Spectrum. I don't know if you're going to feel scared by these, but you will be transported back to a special time and place where horror was a very different beast, shall we say. I feel it would be insulting to the 60s to put these in the second part of the video. The Red Colony Trilogy is a super schlocky triple pack of boob-filled survival horror games, ripped clothes aplenty. On the surface they look terrible, like exploitative nonsense, but don't judge a book by its cover because people say that actually they're alright for what they're going for, kinda like how some B-movies are genuinely entertaining. This was a physical release that was exclusive to PlayAsia and was sold out but very recently got a reprint, so yeah, don't miss out. The Remothered Double Pack is a double pack of Remothered Tormented Fathers and its sequel, Broken Porcelain. And it's a double pack that was released in Japan, but these games were also released individually in the West. I think on the whole, the first game is considered to be a decent game, at least on other consoles, but the second game was universally panned. Resident Evil Origins Collection could have been a slam dunk of a release, like who wouldn't want Resident Evil 0 and Remake on a physical Switch cartridge? Sadly, due to the bloated sizes of these games from Capcom, only Resident Evil 0 is on the cartridge and Remake is a download code and is a chunky 14GB one at that. I suppose if you find it cheap enough these days, I'd buy 0 on a cart for like a tenner, but sadly it's never that price. If they were together, I would say this would be an essential physical release because I know 0 is a flawed and acquired taste, but Remake is just an absolute all-time classic horror. I mean, a pioneer in the genre that inspired most of the other games in this list. Resident Evil Triple Pack is in a similar situation, but thankfully the best game of the bunch is actually on the cartridge, so this package should contain Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6. 4, one of the best games of all time, is on the cartridge. That's why for me, when I found a second-hand copy for a tenner, I had to buy it. That's worth it for me. It also came with download codes for 5 and 6 with their horrendously chunky file sizes. Resi 4 though, I know some people resent it for changing the franchise forever, but it's an all-time classic in my opinion, and that's coming from me, who also loves the original style just as much. Resident Evil Revelations Collection is another sad story of one game being on the cartridge and the other a chunky ass download. Revelations 1 was considered somewhat of a comeback for the series when it originally launched on the 3DS, a return to form when the series was kind of losing its way. I like it a lot, so much so that I've completed it twice, and I'm sure it will be a nice addition to your Switch collection, if you can find this physical cheap. Revelations 2 I've never played, but that is a download code. However, in Japan, they had 3 physical releases of Revelations, believe it or not. Firstly, one that's exactly the same as the Western one, but then there was a budget priced version of that. However, Nicely, quaintly I would say, there is just a standard version of Revelations 1, which somehow makes it more appealing in my opinion. The box art is nice and clean, and you don't have that potential giant download taunting you all the time. So I think I would go for that one, because I'm a simple guy, okay? I need it simple, I need it clean, and that would be ideal for me. Return to Shirinagasu Island is tagged as a horror visual novel. Of course, it's not full on, but it starts to get gruesome and kind of disturbing. From what seems like a normal standard mystery VN, it morphs into something very strange and captivating. It's not overly long and has an interesting art style, and I think you'll enjoy it if you like detective stuff. Saint Kotar is another detective-style game, but more like a classic adventure game set in rural Croatia, a place I briefly lived and have a fondness for. It's got religious themes mixed in with the horror, which is always a decent recipe, and I think point-and-click adventure fans will appreciate this more than those who are just looking for a normal horror game. Saint Maker is another horror game with religious themes, this time more of a straight visual novel, and this is from the same developers as The Letter, which I enjoyed. I haven't read this one, but it's a Play Asia exclusive and is still available in its standard and limited editions, and ever so nicely, there is also a bonus game, a bonus VN included on the cartridge. It's not a horror game, but it's a very nice one called Perfect Gold. Sally Face may sound like a dumb name, and the box art may give you more feelings of like grisly tales for gruesome kids. Anyone remember that? But the game should not be judged on that, since it really does have some creepy stuff going on. It's perhaps comparable to Franbo, which is apt considering this was also done by Super Rare Games, and yeah, good luck getting a copy now for less than $200. Don't you just love limited releases? Saturnalia has an interesting setting with Italian folklore playing a big part in the horror adventure gameplay. It has a super unique rotoscoped art style, which you don't see often. It has non-linear design as you explore the village that changes every time your character dies. So it's kind of like Oxide 104, but this one seems to have gotten it right. In terms of the physical release, it was only done in North America by Limited Run Games. Sense, a cyberpunk ghost story, is an adventure game, almost like a point-and-click game in its feeling, except you can move the character freely with a controller. A decent comparison would be to the Clock Tower series. I really love the setting and atmosphere. The gameplay and animation is, kind of ropey, but this is the kind of lower budget indie game that I can get behind. There's a bit of detective work, a bit of danger, a bit of puzzle, and of course, comically sized boobs. This is a Play Asia exclusive physical release. Sense's Midnight is sort of a sequel to Sense, but they've changed up the gameplay quite a lot. Same kind of like cyberpunk dark world, but now in a full 3D environment with fixed camera angles, imitating some good old PS2 games. Lots of ghouls to avoid, and you're in a park at nighttime, and it's pretty much like free roam, like you can go about connecting all the puzzle pieces together, as it were. I like the ambition, but again, it's very low budget. This was another Play Asia exclusive. Signalis is one of my most favorite indie games like ever, which is big praise from me, being the cynical bastard that I am, but this is a top-down survival horror action game that feels like a really nice evolution from like the original Resident Evil games. If it didn't go into over-the-top, all-guns-blazing action, or perhaps feels more like a portable version of a Resident Evil game that you'd get and is also awesome. Its futuristic dystopia setting is done really well, the visuals are excellent, and I love the puzzles, like really old school, and I highly recommend it. Spirit Hunter Deathmark, Deathmark 2, and NG. I'm grouping these together because they're in the same series and offer a really similar experience. These are horror VNs that are some of the most well produced in the business. They offer smaller gameplay experiences within them too. It's not just like straight dry VN. They offer something else like battling and detective work, and Deathmark 2 is almost breaking out of the VN pigeonhole. Like it gets all side-scrolling like something akin to Sense or The Coma that I've talked about already, just much better produced. Visually, very nice and disturbing. They are great horror VNs. The Tartarus Key looks exactly like my kind of horror indie game, because it looks like it was made on the PS1. Perfect. I love those early 3D visuals. There are lots of traps within the mansion, and also plenty of well-designed puzzles with multiple endings. The horror is light. It's perhaps more about the atmosphere, which they nailed in my opinion. This was released physically in Europe in limited quantities by Super Rare Games. The Bunker was a release from Limited Run Games, and this is one of the few FMV games that's still being made like in 2024. I don't know what's going on. Okay, this was like 5-10 years ago or whatever. I haven't actually played this one, but I've played other games from the same publisher, and so I know you're going to get a really well-made, well-shot, and acted FMV. Maybe the runtime will be a bit short for some considering the price, but you know, it's something really different. The Enigma Machine and Alterity Experience is a double pack of horror games that you can only get physically in Japan. They do have English, but probably not worth it due to both games being very short and not particularly good either. They turned out more like walking sims or proof of concept than actually being fully fledged games. The Last Door is a game that only released physically in Europe, and it was a game from the same developers of the Blasphemous series before they struck gold with that, you know? And this is a point-and-click adventure game that's supposedly very good. Personally, I've never been a fan of the noodle leg pixel style that some of these indie games go for, so I'm a little put off it by myself, but yeah, it has a macabre, Lovecraftian style to it, set over 4 episodes. Yeah, remember when indie games used to do that? I'm glad that seems to have died out with Telltale games. Speaking of which, The Walking Dead: The Final Season. This was Telltale Games' final game before Sleeping with the Fishers, and supposedly it's one of their best, an excellent send-off for them, despite them barely getting it over the finishing line. This is an episodic adventure game following the same story as we see Clementine trying to survive in a world infested by zombies. If you miss point-and-click adventure games, these were supposed to be the successors before they died too. Tokyo Dark Remembrance is a point-and-click adventure game mixed in with visual novel sort of storytelling a little bit, and I think it's a great looking game, great depiction of an actual dark Tokyo. Scares may be few and far between, but it definitely has those horror elements as you, as a detective, go to try and find your missing partner. It seems like a clear-cut mystery at first, but reality starts to get twisted and warped. Physically, this was done by Limited Run Games in North America. Tormented Souls is supposed to be a pretty great throwback to GameCube-era Resident Evil, at least reviews for the Steam version. The Switch version is quite compromised, shall we say. Having seen the comparison of different versions, it seems like, you know, go for Steam or Xbox Series X. It's a shame because it looks absolutely fantastic when it's at its best. I love the camera angles, the framing, the environments, such an awesome atmosphere. If you're not fussed about looks or performance, then, you know, maybe go on the Switch. The Walking Dead Destinies is probably the one Walking Dead Switch game that you don't want. I mean, it's supposed to be absolute trash, not even worth it for hardcore fans of the show, despite an interesting premise of potentially altering the timeline and, like, changing which characters live or die. Whispering Willows is a horror adventure game that's perhaps for a young adult audience, slightly younger people I would say, and actually it's a game I played 8 years ago on the Wii U when I first started doing YouTube, reviewing the absolute trash of indie games on that console, over on my really ancient channel that I hope the world has forgotten. This one was actually okay though, and physically on the Switch it was released by Super Rare Games as part of their Akupara collection. Actually, it's still available at the time of writing this, believe it or not. White Day, a labyrinth-named school, is a port of a Korean horror game from 2001, supposedly one of the best horror games of its era. I'd never heard of it until this Switch port, but when you're in an Asian high school and the janitor is trying to kill you, you know you're in for a good time. This is a game of cat and mouse with plenty of puzzles and weirdness. White Knight is a striking horror adventure game with a black and white art style. Probably not fantastic on your eyes if you're playing it at night in a dark room on a 70-inch TV, but you have to admit it's very intriguing. You solve puzzles with the lights and shadows, of which is where the nasties lie. It's got all the elements of a good survival horror game, although perhaps not the scariest out there. Hard to be scared when you're being blinded by your own TV. The World of Horror. I mean, it's called World of Horror, so it better be a horror game. It's a 1-bit visual game that looks like it was made by a fax machine, which has kind of like always put me off just from like an eye strain perspective alone, and people were genuinely offended when I said that the last time I talked about this game. But come on, I stare at Word documents all day writing this shit for you guys. I don't need more black and white in my life, but this is universally well loved, and I would probably give it a go one day. It's a cult classic point and click kind of choose your own adventure mashup. It's very unique, and I think, fax machines should make a comeback. Like, instant messaging ruins society. I always wanted to receive a marriage rejection come out line by line after 7 hours of waiting for the damn machine to warm up. Yuoni is an import-exclusive physical release only in Japan, but it does have English and is one of the cheaper imports out there, mainly because the game is quite short and not particularly great. It can be compared to something like White Day, like I just mentioned, just made slightly worse. But it does have multiple environments, which is nice. Certainly not essential, but if you want to add something cheap to your collection, why not? Yuppie Psycho sounds like every git that made me regret going to university. When you're a yuppie and you end up at Sheffield Hallam University studying amongst the peasants such as myself, of course you're going to turn into a psycho. Anyways, this is another noodle leg pixel horror game that's really well liked. It's basically like any office job, although maybe slightly underplayed. I think they could really lean more into the horrors of getting the damn printer to actually work. Zombie Army Trilogy and 4 Dead War are 2 separate releases. The naming says it all pretty much. You get the first 3 games in the trilogy package, which I think is great value since nowadays it's pretty cheap to get a hold of. These games can be compared to Left 4 Dead, just without the competitiveness aspect of that. It can be played by yourself, or you can team up with 3 friends online and get through the missions and to survive the hordes. There's also a World War II theme going on as well because, these games were made by the Sniper Elite developers, so obviously there's a zombie Hitler that you can shoot his last remaining testicle off. Sunshine Anthology is a double pack of 16-bit horror games that are being published physically by Premium Edition Games. This includes Sunshine Manor and Camp Sunshine. The latter is the older of the two and is more about exploration and puzzle solving in an 80s slasher movie of sorts, while Sunshine Manor is a bit like a horror Zelda game, and they are both very nice, good that they're together in one lovely package. Alright, those are all the games I would consider decidedly horror with the intent to scare you. Now let's move on to the horror adjacent games, games that have horror themes, settings or feelings, but are not outright horror games. In fact, some may be quite light-hearted, like that goth girl you fancied at school who also seemed to like Westlife as well as Pantera. Maybe even some of these games were made for kids. You may find something that you disagree with, and that's fine. As I've said, I have not played all of these games, so I don't know for certain. Let me know in the comments below if you disagree with anything. Let's get spoopy. Abarembo Tengu was a pretty unique shooter when it released on the Famicom and then on the NES as Zombie Nation. Having a horror game with a floating head and some slightly gory bits must have been quite shocking for the time. This released physically in Japan, and also Europe got some with strictly limited games. The Addams Family Mansion Mayhem, come on, it's obviously not a horror game, but you can't omit the Addams Family from a horror themed list. This was the quandary I was in, guys. This is an action party game, probably quite bobbins, obviously made for kids, just inoffensive shovelware. The Binding of Isaac Afterbirth and The Binding of Isaac Repentance are 2 roguelike action twin-stick shooters. One is sort of like an expansion, but massive enough to be its own game. Have to be honest, I've never played them before, so I don't know exactly how they relate to one another, but I do know they are considered some of the best in the business. Blackbird is one of my favorite shooters on the Switch. It plays a bit like Defender in some parts. It's just encapsulated in one of the most surreal and distinctive art styles I've ever played. It's so good, so weird and likable. It's like visiting your weird aunt's house who's still stuck in the 19th century. A physical release was done by Limited Run only in North America. Blasphemous 1 and Blasphemous 2 are 2 highly gothic Metroidvanias that would be perfectly playable on a cool October evening, offering brutal combat, disturbing imagery, weird and grotesque monsters to fight. They're not scary, but they're damn cool. The first game is a bit of a legend, while the sequel, which came out many years later, didn't exactly set the genre to new heights, just offered more of the same with some quality of life improvements. Blood Rain Revamped and Blood Rain 2 Revamped are 2, I can't say they are legendary action games found on the PS2. Some consider them to be either mediocre or so bad they're good. Infamous may be a better phrase, but the first 2 games are available physically on the Nintendo Switch thanks to Limited Run Games in North America. action vampire games that were in that early cool vampire scene with Blade and stuff. Probably very nostalgic for a lot of people. I've never played them, but I would like to play them someday myself. Blood Rain Betrayal Fresh Bites is a more recent game in the series. Came out quite a while after those PS2 games. Because this was a game from 2011 and made by WayForward of all companies, it means it's a work for hire game. It's just acceptable. It's a side-scrolling action game that only resembles a franchise in name and character. Again, it was done by Limited Run in North America. Bloodstained Ritual of the Night is a gothic Metroidvania that's pretty much trying to be the newest Castlevania game just without the name attached to it. Many say it did a good job of capturing that Igavania feel, especially since he was involved in the production of this, but it's perhaps best played on some other console because the Switch, well, many people felt it was not up to scratch. I still enjoyed it though. Bloodstained, the Double Pack are two games that are spin-offs of the main Bloodstained game, but many consider these to be the stars of the show. Instead of going for the Metroidvania approach, these are more in line with the original linear Castlevanias and do a fantastic job of imitating it. Now, individually, these games were physically released in North America by Limited Run Games, but now there is a more affordable and accessible Double Pack in Japan that does have English. Boo! Party is an adventure game about exploring a haunted mansion where there is a party going on. You are a photographer and you take naughty photos of some of the creatures there. It's incredibly tongue-in-cheek, but a bit like Rocky Horror Picture Show, that kind of thing. The physical for this was only released in Europe and actually includes nude content unlike the digital release. Book of Demons was a game done physically by Super Rare Games in Europe quite a while back. It's a deck-building roguelike dungeon crawler that has a medieval horror theming to it. Not very strong, but I thought, strong enough to put it in this list. I mean, it's got like green glowy lighting. If that's not horror, I don't know what is. You can almost smell the pumpkins on this one. Castlevania Anniversary Collection, the Advance Collection, and Dominus Collection are three essential Castlevania collections that contain some of the most classic and inspirational horror games ever made. I think back in the mid-80s on the NES, Castlevania would have unquestionably be labeled as a horror game. Not so much now, but the amount of games that have tried to copy them and their awesomeness is uncountable. Sadly, all three collections were done by Limited Run in North America, with the Dominus Collection, which is the best of the bunch of them, only recently having pre-orders opened. Who knows when they were sent out, but the previous two, the Anniversary Collection and Advance Collection, if you don't hang about, Video Games Plus do have some copies of them still available with the links down below. Cathedral is a bit like if Ghosts and Goblins was a Metroidvania. It may not look like much, but it genuinely is an excellent game with plenty of content. It can be tough, but if this was an NES game, it would be an all-time classic. Dodging Grim Reapers and floating skulls has never been so good. It was published physically in North America by Premium Edition Games, and you can still get the Retro Edition on their website. Close to the Sun does have a horror game tag to it, but I think the actual horror aspect is somewhat limited from what I can tell. I've never played it before, but I want to because it looks pretty nice. It's kind of just a walking sim of sorts, but in an Art Deco style that will give you memories of the wonderful BioShock, a game series I did consider adding to this part of the list, but thankfully that decision was taken away from me because none of the games are fully on the Switch cartridge. All of them require a download on the system. Corpse Killer is a game you'll laugh at more than will scare you, hence why I definitely put it in this section. It's an FMV game that was notoriously on the Sega CD, probably for a joke or a meme, maybe even nostalgic to some. You could even have this on during a Halloween party, and some would love it. The physical release was done by Limited Run in North America only. I think we need to bring up the Cotton series, the perfect comfy sort of Halloween kind of shooter. Of course, they're difficult enough to make you want to rip your own balls off, but at least they're cute. There are lots of them on the Switch. There is Cotton Reboot, there's Cotton Fantasy, also known as Rock and Roll, there's Cotton 2 and Boomerang in the Saturn Tribute Collection, and Strictly Limited Games did the old-ass Cotton 100% and Panorama Cotton in Europe individually, while Japan got those two in a nice double pack. And don't forget the latest one, Rainbow Cotton, which is a remake of the Dreamcast entry. Cult of the Lamb is a pretty striking game. It was an indie darling for a good while and still remains one of the most celebrated indie games in the last couple of years. obviously not scary, but with strong imagery and strong themes trapped within its cutesy art style, it's a game that will stick with you for a long while. Dark Devotion is a Souls-like action game which is as dark as the name suggests. Yes, it's tough, but reviewers claimed that it's more about skill than RNG, which is always a good thing in my opinion. It was a fairly early limited run physical release, so you'll have to resort to double the price on eBay to get a physical copy these days. The Dark Side Detective and The Dark Side Detective: A Fumble in the Dark are two point-and-click adventure games with a heavy focus on comedy. You're a detective who gets involved in solving the crimes of the supernatural with your trusty cop sidekick. Both of these were done by Super Rare Games in Europe. These are pretty commendable, but don't have anything on the likes of Monkey Island or Broken Sword, but if you need some mildly spoopy things along with your adventure, it may be worth a look. Dead Cells and Dead Cells Return to Castlevania. Of course, if Castlevania is on this list, then these must be too. These are excellent games, or is it game? I don't know what to call it these days. It's more like an amorphous blob of content that I don't know which angle to look at it from. Either way, whether you want horror or not, you need this in your life because it's a phenomenal package with intense and endlessly replayable gameplay. I love it. Death End Request, Death End Request 2, and Death End Request Code Z or Z are JRPGs. Yes, JRPGs with horror themes to them. Certainly not overt, but enough for people to praise that it's doing something different to the norm. I haven't played this series myself, so I can't personally verify it, but I heard there's like gore and some like really bad endings that you can get and stuff, so maybe give them a try if you want something unusual. Death or Treat is a pretty cool looking spoopy game. You control a cute little ghost hacking and slashing in this side-scrolling action game, trying to get big combos and save the town that wouldn't be out of place in a Tim Burton movie. Unfortunately, the gameplay appears to be a bit of a letdown, with it not coming together well at all. Death Road to Canada has you on the run from the zombie hordes, trying to make it to the Canadian border, where one supposes the zombies don't exist. Probably too cold for them. The poor things probably have a tough time regulating their own body temperature. Anyways, it is a fun action roguelike that was a Play Asia exclusive physical release. Death Smiles 1 and 2, really nice themed shooter from Cave. It's a bit like Cotton, but perhaps more focused on providing top-notch horizontal shooting gameplay as you shoot Grim Reapers, Crows, and Cyclopses out of the sky. Demonica Everlasting Night is another game inspired by the Castlevania series, but this time they tried to add some sexy into it, and has combat more like a beat 'em up with different combos. The presentation is a bit iffy, if I'm being honest. I don't really like the looks of this one. It was released physically in North America by VGNY, Video Games New York. Devil May Cry Trilogy would be a really nice purchase if it were not for the fact that only the first game is on the cartridge and the other two came with a download code, which is now long expired. Ooh, but hey, I'm sure a lot of us have really fond memories about these PS2 classics, and having, the first physically, if you can get the cartridge for like a tenner, why not? It's just a shame they aren't all on the cartridge. The Distraint Collection is a double pack of games that I believe are more surreal than something designed to be scary. I haven't played them for long enough. Anyways, these have a unique art style and some weird visuals. Play Asia exclusive, one of their earlier efforts, but they still do have some stock left. They have reprinted it a couple of times. Doki Doki Literature Club Plus is another one of those spoiler moments for being on this list, because what on the surface is a happy-go-lucky slice of life visual novel turns into something very sinister. A lot of visual novel aficionados do not appreciate this game very much since it almost parodies the genre, but I think it's a great intro into what the genre can really do, subverting your expectations, stuff like that. I think it's great. Oh my god, there are so many Doom games and physical variations even on the Switch. Some have all the games, some are downloads, but yeah, if you want to kick demon arse, then these are the perfect action games to listen to some metal music to. Maybe they're not true horror, but back in 1994, whatever it was, yeah, they definitely would be horror. There's Doom 2016, there's Doom 64, Doom Eternal, Doom Classics Collection, and God knows what else. I can't be bothered to keep track of it. There's so much Doom, and it's awesome. Dredge is another one of those kind of spoiler-ish, but I think the cat's long out of the bag with this one. They even leaned into it on the DLC. On the surface, it's a trawler fishing game, but there is an essence of the supernatural about it, and it's supposedly a really good game. There was one print of the physical release when it came out initially, but there's also going to be a new physical release, which will include the DLC on the cartridge and have a mini collector's edition. Dungeon and Gravestone is a very mysterious game. It's actually kind of like a mystery dungeon game. There's a really decent atmosphere with this one, and the game's systems and mechanics are not explained well. You have to kind of find your own way, figure out what everything means. It really lives up to its genre, and that's why I quite like it despite the game being very simple on the surface. It's got lots of secrets, and the physical release was limited to Japan only, but it does have English. Maybe not worth the quite high asking price though. If you ever get it for like 20 bucks, go for it. Dungeon Munchies is more of a humorous game as you fight monsters and ghouls and then you cook them. Depending on what you eat, it will affect your play style, which is a gimmicky mechanic, but interesting. I've heard mixed things about this one. Some people think it's like the best thing ever, some think it's incredibly messy, so you might have to make your own mind up on this one. Elder Rand is another one of those side-scrolling action games that may seem a bit out of place on this list, but for me this would not look out of place in a Halloween playlist. It has a very nightmarish world with some occult things going on and very surreal gore. It is a left field choice, I'll admit it, but I stand by its inclusion in this video. And just for clarification, it is definitely called Elder Rand, not Elder Land, which some online retailers have listed it for, so if you search for Elder Rand, you might not find it, okay? Ender Lilies, Quietus of the Nights is another one of those side-scrolling action games that on the surface would not be considered a horror, but the game is home to some really horrendous-looking creatures that want to murder this cute little girl. It's also an absolutely banging game that should be played regardless. Farmers vs. Zombies. I mean, alright, I get it. But you know, of course it's going to be on a horror games list if the name literally states that it's got farmers in it. Have you ever messed with a farmer? They whip out the double barrel faster than you can say justifiable manslaughter. Anyways, this game has two names, the other being Farm for Your Life, which I think they used to try and hide the fact that it is actually a mobile game. Anyways, I mostly included this to make a joke about farmers, something like that. Flipping Death was an early Nintendo Switch physical game. This is a quirky adventure platformer where you have to change between the living world and the dead. You possess people in order to let the deceased rest in peace. Ghost Parade is perhaps the very definition of a spoopy platformer. You collect 30 ghostly companions, each of whom have unique abilities in order to overcome the enemies and obstacles. It's a really great premise, but I think the controls are not exactly the smoothest, and the animation looks a little ropey. Some would consider this a bad game, others may say it's a hidden gem. Ghostbusters, the video game remastered, was a very welcome return to the Ghostbusters world, a franchise that's just led to endless disappointment since the credits rolled on the first movie. People have been yearning for something good to happen with the Ghostbusters logo slapped on it, and before the recent movies, which I don't know what people think about them, there was this video game and it was considered a true sequel to Ghostbusters. Good writing, good performances, and solid ghost-catching gameplay. Ghostbusters Spirit Unleashed is a 4v1 asymmetrical multiplayer game. It's Dead by Daylight but with cartoony Ghostbusters. I don't know if it's any good, nor if it has any single player content, but reviews seem to indicate it is a decent time, especially with all the DLC content, which I believe is in the Switch version. Goosebumps the game, a staple of everyone's childhood, even those kids who didn't read, like me. My mom didn't ask me to read shit as a kid. Maybe she knew it would be pointless because of my future profession as an English teacher. Randomly, this game was made by Way Forward and published by Game Mill, who are not a great company, but it looks like it was an alright point-and-click adventure game for kids, or adults who wish they were still kids. I ain't got time for that. I'm playing my PS1 tonight, okay? Grim Fandango Remastered is a classic point-and-click adventure game. It's one that I've tried to play about 17 times before I check out after like an hour. I really need to sit down and play this properly one day. Full of weird logic, ill-advised controls, dodgy camera angles. It's a classic. It's one of the funnier, most well-produced adventure games of all time that pretty much killed the genre for a decade after it flopped. What a legacy! Gal Guardian's Demon Purge is a pretty good action-packed Metroidvania starring girls from the Galgun series. Weird mashup, but it works. Firing machine guns in a gothic castle against Grim Reapers, never been so much fun. Unfortunately, it's quite a short game, even for indie creates, but if you can find it on the cheaper end to get your money's worth, it should be a decent purchase. Haunted House is a remake or perhaps a reimagining of the Atari 2600 classic. I put classic in quotation marks because I'm quoting other people who may have said it without realizing that words have consequences. And actually, you know what? In terms of an arcadey game with replayability, it looks alright. Atari have been doing some decent things in recent years. Have a Nice Death is a 2D action roguelike where you play as Death who's been worked to death. Like, can't you get an assistant this day and age? The visuals and theming alone put this into the category of this video, and thankfully it's a really nice game to boot. Heidelberg 1693 could have a case of being in the first part of the video, but it's not supposed to be scary. Bloody fun game though, pretty hardcore action platformer set in the dark ages, and there's all sorts of horrific crap going on. This won't be for everyone, but if you want something similar to the original Castlevania, it's a good start. Hello Neighbor, Hello Neighbor 2, and Hello Neighbor Hide and Seek. Yeah, there are 3 Hello Neighbor games on the Nintendo Switch. You could make a case for them being in the first part due to the, cat and mouse nature of the gameplay. That may make some people's bowels wobble a little bit, but for me, the series is just overly cartoony, and it looks terrible on the Switch, at least the first game that I played. Maybe they improved the series, I don't know. I don't need to know after I played the first one, because it was kind of crap. Hotel Castlevania 3, Monsters Overboard. Yeah, is there anything scarier than a modern Adam Sandler movie? Bring back Billy Madison, a film I like to call shite but alright. At least when I watched it when I was like 10 years old. I'm still mentally there, so one would assume it holds up. Anyways, this is a kids game made by Outright Games, so it'll be mediocre but acceptable, just like most of Adam Sandler's movies. Hotel Transylvania, Scary Tale Adventures. Oh Jesus, I wrote that last bit without realizing there's a second Hotel Transylvania game. Again, same sort of thing. Same publisher, same mediocrity, same rubbish joke about Adam Sandler. Infernax is another one of those games that feels like a classic Castlevania game. It's got the 8-bit imagery, but this is actually a Metroidvania and it's supposed to be like 100% excellent, like way better than you'd think. The physical was distributed by Limited Run in North America, but in Europe it did get a retail release, which I think will be the cheaper one to get nowadays. Not by much though, since it did have a fairly low print. Inscription is tagged as a horror game, but I think a card game can only go so far in trying to scare people. It's a bit more unsettling than scary, but for the gameplay it's supposed to be incredible for those who like card stuff, but you guys know me. Into the Dead 2 is an FPS action game that maybe could have gone in the first part, but now that I'm looking at it, but I don't think it's supposed to be scary, you just happen to be shooting zombies, and this is a mobile game and very much feels like it. Don't let the screenshots fool you into thinking you'll be getting something tasty. It's not, it'll be very sour and bitter, like my YouTube career. Iris Fall is a surreal puzzle adventure game where you use light and shadows similar to White Knight, but I think this is considered the better game. Not scary, but has a really nice art style and atmosphere. Some say the puzzles can be rote and tedious, while others think they just have the right balance in difficulty. Make your own mind up. Komajo Remilia Scarlet Symphony is a game that got a physical release in Japan first, then a year later Limited Run did it in North America. And it's likely they'll do the second game as well. Sadly, they declined to include English on the second game's Japanese release, probably to appease Limited Run, so that game is not on this list, but this one is, and it's obviously inspired by Gothic Castlevania, but it's linear and has bullet hell elements which I personally don't think fit well with the controls of the game, but people told me just get good bro. Kwaidan is a kind of a spoopy horror game. It has a PS2 vibe to it as you fight off yokai in something that reminds me of Onimusha, although this is a bit cuter. It also has some slightly weird controls that were made for when it was originally on PC, and it feels more like a puzzle adventure game, and this was a Play Asia exclusive physical release. Little Witch Novetta is another one of those perfectly cutesy Halloween games, as you are an adorable witch who takes part in a 3D action adventure game that's got third-person shooting in it as you blast monsters with your magic. I like this game a hell of a lot, and I think more people should play it. Lollipop Chainsaw Repop is definitely not cute. Oh no, you're a cheerleader with a chainsaw going after the undead. It's a winner. It can't possibly be bad. Limited Run took orders for this in North America, but it also got a physical release in Japan without censored artwork. You get the full cleavage, not the badly photoshopped boob reduction. Lovecraft's Untold Stories was released only in Europe, but it's an action roguelike with some really nice pixel art in the enemies and environments, but the extreme difficulty has put a lot of people off with this one, with the endless hordes and the instant death. and doing the same thing over and over again. Even those who do enjoy it are very hesitant to recommend it to others. Luigi's Mansion 2 HD and Luigi's Mansion 3. Man, it's a shame there's also not Luigi's Mansion 1. It should have been bundled with like 1 and 2 together. Missed opportunity. Anyways, 2 is a very good game. It was one of my favorite 3DS games. Maybe suits the Switch a bit less, but I don't know, it's been a while. 3 is just one of the best Switch games, full stop. It might be one of the best looking Switch games ever made, actually. I think it's essential. Man-Eater is not something any man will say no to, unless it's in fact a wild animal like a giant shark. Anyways, this is another reverse horror game where you are the monster. A bored shark goes on a bender, full of dark humor. It's a great game to let off some steam to. It also has like RPG elements, which is a funny thing to think about. Merchant Forest is as spoopy as it gets. This is a 3-in-1 game. The first game is kind of cute, a 1-hour adventure game, but then it transforms into 2 dungeon crawling JRPGs as you fight off flaming skulls and the like. It's just a weird package overall that was only released physically in Japan, Korea, and Hong Kong, and all of those have English. Moon Scars is a super dark, moody Metroidvania, Souls-like, with a pretty monochrome art style, aside from all the blood that's been spurted everywhere. A lot of people will say it's more style over substance, with the art being much better than the unbalanced gameplay. Kinda looks like Dead Cells though. Morbid, The Seven Acolytes, is described as a horror punk action RPG with a heavy Lovecraftian inspired art style. This only released physically in Europe and is one of the most expensive standard edition games that you can try to buy. Hopefully there will be a reprint because it's a pretty badass game. Morbid, The Lords of Ire is the sequel, almost unrecognizable since now it's behind the shoulder, like a Dark Souls game. It's also more widely available, with it also being released in North America alongside Europe. I don't know what to think about this game. It's alright, but it's not my normal type of game. When I played it, I found it to be okay, but not something I'd probably go back to. It's Dark Souls we have at home, and I don't really have that much love for Dark Souls to begin with. Never Awake is the perfect shooter if you're wanting a grotesque horror-themed experience. This is a really nice twin-stick shooter with lots of content that's more about the joy of playing rather than getting the best score. Certainly not one for score attackers, but that's fine by me. It has some really awesomely designed bosses and enemies, and I had such a good time playing this. It has some weird looping mechanics that add an extra layer to the experience. The physical was released only in Japan, but it does have English. Night Trap probably scared a few people back in the day, probably the same people who were scared by the Power Rangers monsters, but it's just campy, crappy fun as you watch people get kidnapped or insinuating that they just got murdered. But to be fair, you'd be more interested in finding out if there is like a shower scene. That's what I'm looking at. This was released physically in North America via Limited Run Games. Nightmare Boy was released physically only in Europe and is a cute-ish platformer that's very standard and gimmick-free, at least from what I can remember when I played it like 7 years ago. It didn't leave much of an impression on me and is certainly not an essential release. I believe it only came in a collector's edition. Obakedoro is a game of cops and robbers if it was made by Tim Burton. It's a cute little online multiplayer where you get all Dead by Daylight, but in the cutest way possible. I don't believe there's much single player content here, so I don't think importing this from Japan or Asia, which were the only places that it released physically, I don't think it'd be much of a priority. Omen of Sorrow would be a cool fighting game to whip out at Halloween if you didn't fancy Darkstalkers. This was famous horror characters, mostly from classical literature, beating the crap out of each other. I haven't played it, but I heard it's competent, which is what you'd hope from any game. The physical release was a Play Asia exclusive. Sherlock Holmes The Awakened mixes the famous Victorian detective with Cthulhian mythology. It's an interesting horror mystery game that is a remake of a game from 2008. This is from Frogware, who I would consider one of the very few developers out there who still try to keep things within a reasonable budget without being indie. Supposed to be good all things considered, with the physical release only being available in South Korea. It has English though. Scoutfold Bloody Pack is from Red Art Games, but also has an ESRB edition available at VGP. This is a double pack that contains Scoutfold Usurper and Scoutfold Shrouded Insanity, which are action RPGs with a very darkly bloody horror theme to them. Supposed to be pretty good, but I think this physical resoundingly fell under the radar when it released. Skeletak was a very random release from Konami when they decided to dabble with indies for about 5 minutes before realizing people just wanted Castlevania and Contra and Suikoden. This is an underworld themed mini Metroidvania. It was released physically by Limited Run Games in North America. Slain Back from Hell was an early Switch physical release that smashed players' balls to bits with how tough it was. This game is heavy metal in every way, right from the music to the art style to the gameplay. It's gonna attack your senses and then puke on your face. Good times if you've got the stomach for it. Source of Madness is an eldritch horror-themed 2D action game whose main claim to fame is that the artwork for the monsters is generated by AI, making up some incredibly messed up foes, which I think probably suits the Lovecraftian vibe. I think that dude would probably be okay with AI, but it is a big sticking point for many people, and let's face it, Lovecraft's opinions, they're a bit dodgy. He was a good writer, but you wouldn't want to talk to him, you know what I mean? It was released physically by Super Red Games in Europe. Spooky Spirit Shooting Gallery. You can't have a Halloween party without this playing in the background. It's a simple carnival style game with a bizarrely premium price, but the physical version can thankfully dip pretty low if you've got the patience to wait for it. I definitely want to get this because I miss games like Point Blank and Time Crisis. Bring them back, guys. Come on, Namco. Strange Brigade is a slightly exotic take on Rebellion's zombie army games. Same kind of thing, but this was released physically only by Super Red Games in Europe. Weird that such an online focused game would have like a limited release. That doesn't make sense to me. Stubbs the Zombie should be loved just for the soundtrack alone. Amazing retro-style covers from modern-ish bands. The gameplay is a reverse horror as you, as a zombie, eats the brains of the people in the open-world city. Pretty nice, if showing its 2005 age a bit too well for some people. The Last Faith got a recent physical release on the Switch and is one of the best looking pixel art games that I've ever seen. With huge giant sprites horrifying in nature, the game itself is a Metroidvania with a touch of the Souls-like apparently, so it's tough, but you've got lots of mobility and weapon types to take on the fiends that get in your way. The Outbound Ghost had a troubled release, with the original publisher releasing it in an unfit state and leaving the developer out to dry. Despite that seemingly being sorted out by now, what's not being sorted out is the game itself. Despite looking like a nice spoopy version of Paper Mario, apparently it gets a lot of things wrong and hasn't actually been fixed since the controversy. They Bleed Pixels was another game published physically by Premium Edition Games. This is a brutal action platformer that will get your pulse racing and your controller cracked from the gripping pressure that you will put on it. Not for people faint of heart, but if you like a bloody good challenge, it will be one to look into. Vampire is a game developed by Don't Nod, who did the Life is Strange games. This is a different theme, of course, but it's still a story-rich game that just so happens to have vampires in it. The horror is quite light on this one, but with combat likened to Bloodborne, if it was whipped up over a weekend, it's supposed to be a pretty good game. Werewolf, The Apocalypse Heart of the Forest is an adventure visual novel game, often found very cheap physically these days. If you watch my visual novels video, ranking them on the Switch, you'll know that it's not particularly highly regarded, but it's something a bit different in its presentation. Yamawari The Long Night Collection and Yamawari Lost in the Dark are two separate releases of 3 games. The Long Night Collection contains the first 2 games in the Yamawari series, and Lost in Dark was the recent 3rd game released by itself. Each game is a very cutesy but atmospheric adventure horror game. It's spooky but not scary, nice, well put together games, and worth adding to your spoopy collection if you can find them for an affordable price. They are not exactly cheap to get a hold of these days. I'm hoping for a VGP reprint. Zombieland Double Tap Road Trip was a really random video game tie-in to the forgotten movie sequel. Does anyone remember Zombieland 2? I suppose there's a bit of nostalgia via the fact that movie tie-ins rarely exist anymore. It's hardly the PS2 era. But on the other hand, it's just as bland as they almost always have been. Zombie Night Terror, only released physically in Europe, not easy to get a hold of, but surprisingly, VGP still have copies of the deluxe edition for some reason. This game gives you the job of spreading a zombie pandemic with strategy elements and even puzzle stuff, and it's being compared to something like Lemmings, just obviously not as violent. Zombies Ate My Neighbors and Ghoul Patrol. Zombies Ate My Neighbors is an all-time classic multiplayer action game. I played it so much as a kid. Balls hard, but so full of personality as you try to rescue survivors in a zombie apocalypse, amongst other hammer horror delights. I still have the jumping in water sound in my head. Ghoul Patrol I'd literally never heard of until this collection. I don't know how that passed me by. Sadly, Limited Run did this, so you'll have to find a copy on eBay or something. Wallachia, it's a name I can't actually say, and no matter how many times I've tried to say it, someone in the comments has to correct me. Even the pedants can't seem to agree on how to say this, but we can all agree this is a pretty awesome game. I really like it a lot. It's like if Castlevania had a baby with Contra, and the physical goes for a pretty penny these days, not cheap. And there we have it, ladies, gentlemen, physical fiends, horror game physical releases on the Nintendo Switch. Which ones would you like to add to this list, and which ones would you recommend? Please let me know in the comments. If you would like to support the channel and purchase video games, consider doing so with the links below. Everyone's a winner there. Of course, if you like physical games media, subscribe. Why wouldn't you? I hope you all have a fantastic day. Take care.